Hi, I'm Mike Brofman, and welcome to another episode of Song and Wine. I am joined here with Jocelyn Dueck, and today we are going to discuss Louis Durey as part of our Les Six series. The next concert's coming up December 9th. It's a Tuesday at 7:30 p.m., but make sure you show up early because at 7 we'll have a pre-concert lecture on the works of Louis Durey. This concert actually features Louis Durey and Germaine Taillefer, who are probably the two most obscure of Les Six, but not without great genius in their writing. We're doing brunch edition because it's actually Sunday morning when we're filming this because of scheduling, so we've made mimosas, which I guess wine liberally defined.
Right.
But, so cheers. Mimosas are good. I haven't had one in a really long time.
Right.
So let's just dive right in. Let's just tell us about Louis Durey and what do you think the important things to know about Durey and his story and him as a composer are.
I think because Durey is not very well known, he's shrouded in some mystery, and I think people like to peg him as being one thing or the other. He is all of those things that people say. He was a hardline communist. He did leave the group Les Six. He didn't have similar aesthetics with Jean Cocteau, and he celebrated poets who were, I guess, egalitarians, but none of these things. I think when you look at them through, in retrospect, it seems like these things are really isolated events that may have occurred in his life. But in talking with his daughter, I got the sense that she didn't want Durey to be remembered simply as the person who left Les Six.
I think it's an interesting, and it's a good point. In all of Les Six in general, every member of Les Six had a love-hate relationship with their members of this collective. The collective actually only really was something for a very brief amount of time in the 20s, and these composers lived, some of them, into the 70s and 80s. And they always felt Poulenc and Milhaud, and they always felt a little ambivalent about it. They felt like it made them be seen as less serious composers when all of them had aspirations of more serious things. And I think another thing that's sort of important in historical context is Durey's communism, which now it seems a pretty radical point of view, but in the 20s, in the context of the Russian Revolution at that period of time, communism was a pretty, half the world was communist. And to be a communist was not so much of an outsider thing, especially in Europe, and it was in a socialist country like France. So he wasn't this sort of like doing these strange things and was singular in them. He was part of a larger historical context, I think.
Yeah, I think it helps to remember that he was anti-fascist, and because of the events of the time, he was revolting against, he was embracing communism. This is what I understand to be true about Durey, but he was also reacting against some horrible things that were happening to people around him. He actually joined the resistance. He joined the musicians' arm of the resistance, which was called the Fédération Musicale Populaire, I think. And in the end, it only ended up being 30 members by the end of 1944. But they had certain tenets in this group, and those tenets were in line with what Durey wanted, which was to celebrate music of the people.
Yeah.
So to give a little background on Durey, he was the oldest member of the group. He was 11 years older than Poulenc, and he actually was one of the people who started the group going. He organized a concert with the Six, and he organized an album of the Six, which is published, which has one piano piece from each member of the group. And he was kind of the secretary of the group for a while before Jean Cocteau came along and kind of co-opted this group. Maybe you've said this in other interviews, but it was Henri Collet, who was a music critic, who dubbed them Les Six. And so there was this kind of external force at work wanting to put these people together in the group. The music of that time, the music that Durey wrote during that era, 1916, 1917, 1918, some of the pieces we're doing on the program are from that era, to me embodied the music of Les Six. They were tuneful, they were simple, there was a clarity, there were all of those things that they were striving to do with Satie as their musical grandfather, so to speak. And Durey's music was just so clear, so concise. And I don't know, to me it was the epitome of what we think of as Les Six music for the time.
Yeah, the only Durey that I performed was the 3 Patron poems, which are really, really beautiful works. And when we did them in the context of these sort of Les Six tasters of one work, and I always find that they stick out when you they're the ones that people tend to remember.
Well, they're tuneful.
They're very beautiful and simple, and they have this certain melancholy to them that's, I think, very, very attractive.
Yeah. So he was, he was on board with everything, and he was certainly putting out a lot of music at the time. And then I think that, I mean, I should speak delicately about it, but I think that the impression is that Jean Cocteau came in and saw that this group had potential, and he was about chic displays of creating. I don't know. It was like a social media for Paris at the time. There was an image he was trying to portray with the Six, and Durey didn't want to be a part of that. He didn't, as far as I know, wasn't important to him to look cool, to see and be seen. He was a man of integrity. He had really strong ideals, and I think that maybe when Jean Cocteau started going in this direction with the group, he realized that they were completely at odds.
This sounds very much like a Yoko Ono and the Beatles story.
Yes.
The sort of outsider who comes in and thinks they know better than those who are already in the group, and it creates a divide.
Yeah, and certainly he did a lot for the group because there was more. Probably we know more about them today because he did have this vision. But given Durey's politics and his ideals, it just wasn't meant to be. So his daughter Arlette had very firmly said, in her gentle way, there was not a rift between Cocteau and Durey. They simply were not aligned. So she said, it wasn't that there was a big argument and there was a stake driven between them. They just didn't agree. And so Durey went on from there and, had written all of this great music prior to 1920. He also did a lot of study of 18th century composers, and he did study of Jocelyn and he had this kind of backward-looking glance. He was considered neo-romantic. He was okay with that title. So we have to remember, he was considered neo-romantic even in the face of this Les Six sound. He embraced this. Debussy was his idol. He idolized him. Not that Debussy was romantic, but in the album of the Six, he also he composed a Roman sans parole, a song without words, and that's a backward glance to Mendelssohn. So he was okay with that. And then, when he joined the resistance, this was a legitimate, dangerous enterprise.
Yeah.
People were being killed over their activities with the resistance, and so he really put his money where his mouth was. He spent a lot of time during those years looking into folk tunes in France, and wrote many, many choral arrangements of folk tunes, dozens of them. And so that was kind of in the intervening years prior to the 50s and 60s, when we have some of the pieces that we've got on this program. I wanted to include the 2 poems of Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah.
I've wanted to perform them forever.
And I'm excited about them, Ho Chi Minh being the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party.
Right. So Ho Chi Minh wrote in French, and he lived in France. I don't know a lot about whether or not they met, but this is, you know, something we see on an American program and think, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, edgy. No, and I think, well, that war was really a French war before it was an American war, and and I think the Communist Party in Vietnam arose as a resistance to French colonialism, I think, originally, and then America sort of took, you know, when the communists, they saw it in their interest to start fighting.
Yeah.
But I guess now that we're on this subject, it's good to segue to my next topic. I think we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I feel like Durey is a composer whose politics are really intimately entwined in his art more than a lot of other composers. And there are composers who have written political works or, you know, works that are clearly aligned with an ideology. But I think, how do you think Durey's politics sort of uniquely affected his
That's a
work?
great question. I mean, they did. You could hear it in music. So in this music of 1918, there's that laissez ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you listen to the music he writes, especially after the 50s, let's see, do we have any examples of, you know, the Eloire and the Ho Chi Minh are dating to later. There you hear a return to music that's almost more episodic. You know, in the Petronius songs and the Theocritus songs that we're doing on this program, they're not episodic. They're simple little gems of music, and the music within it is really stays in one place. But prior to that, he dabbled in atonality, and his music was more stream of consciousness, in my opinion. And then after 1950, his music again became something that was more stream of consciousness. So he would be working with a motive or a theme, and then a few measures later really kind of go in a different direction with it. So you hear this departure from a theme pretty overtly in the music. The music of the intervening period, when he was writing all of this folk music, sounds really, you know, martial. It sounds really like a call to arms is maybe a strong way to put it, but it sounds like he is, you know, using a style that you would use to attract the attention of a group of people and call them to a cause.
And I think that sort of social realism, as defined by sort of communist aesthetics in communist countries, was, and this is why certain Russian composers were always getting in trouble, like Shostakovich and to a lesser degree Prokofiev, is they saw music and art as a way to sort of support the proletariat and support the worker and call the worker to their highest aspiration. So music had to have that certain aggressiveness. You know, in the works that Shostakovich and Prokofiev wrote that were sort of state approved, they always end with these big triumphant endings and lots of big, you know, there's this Shostakovich piece that sort of won the Stalin Prize, the Song of the Forest, which is just, you know, very big and just sort of singing a lot about it, like, you know, how the forests are majestic, like the worker is, and all that. So it's interesting, and in Russia, a lot of composers were writing in that style under pain of punishment, which could have meant death, and it was sort of like they were writing because they didn't want to get. But it's interesting of Durey writing in this style in a country where, I mean, he was free to write however he wanted, and he was choosing to write that way, and that I think also sometimes probably creates a different relationship to that style of music, because I think in the 20th century there's always an interesting relationship, especially in this time period when the world was split into the free and the Iron Curtain, how composers related to their society at large became a much more important question than people like Mozart or Beethoven really thought about. They didn't really think that way.
He actually wrote music for film too. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, I didn't.
He did, like, I think there were 4 different films. One, I researched, I tried to find these films actually in the Bibliothèque Nationale and in various other places, and one was called Oradour-sur-Glane, which was a place in France where there were a lot of members of the resistance in this town, and the regime just razed this town. I mean, they killed practically all of the inhabitants of this town. So the films that he would have set music to were films, I guess, of awareness / films of propaganda.
Yeah.
And, you know, Auric, of course, did a lot of film.
He was known as the big, and Honegger wrote a lot of scores for film. I think that gets into generally Les Six had that kind of divide between popular music and art music, and they always liked to play with that, and that either came across as including jazz elements in their music, or popular, or in a sense, popular music and folk tunes.
They called it everyday music, which I love.
Yeah, I kind of like, or like furniture music is what Satie called it.
Right.
But I think that also ended up applying to a lot of the composers writing, you know, film music or incidental music, in that it was music that just had a purely practical purpose, or was utilitarian. And it was also in the context of the rise of mass media and popular culture, which didn't exist before them. You know, the divide between the idea of a mass, you know, rock stars and popular figures that was starting with, you know, sort of icons in film and music and what that. So they were really they come at a very interesting point in history. I feel like Les Six, and in various different ways each capture different elements of society that were changing very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
I think I said talked about in the first interview with John Moore that they were the first generation of people who their lives were radically different at the end than they were in the beginning. You know, if someone like in Mozart's time or in Beethoven's time, even though there was huge historical changes, technology wasn't substantially different, or not nearly to the degree that it was.
In the 20th century.
These composers straddled when there was no electricity to when there was television, you know. And so I think in various ways they all respond to that, that these sudden, abrupt changes in their music. And you said, you know, that a lot of Durey's music has this sort of episodic nature, this sort of not one constant thing. And I think that's his way of capturing what's going on historically.
Well, some say too that, of course the episodes I'm talking about occur later, but in the music of Les Six, there are often what are called crosscuts, which happened a lot in Stravinsky and in the music of Debussy, where you'd have one idea, let's say 4 measures of that, juxtaposed immediately with another idea, let's say 4 measures following that. And in French music, there's no transition, there's no rubato in the transition between those two ideas. And my professors in grad school, or one of my professors, said that one of the reasons for that was the advent of media. The fact that you would look at a picture of somebody, maybe caught mid-run, who half their foot's off of the frame, and this idea that something could be captured visually like that, transferred to music. And so you've got, you know, these episodes. The episodes that I'm thinking about are in Image, Clouseau, which is basically Saint Jean Perse, also known as Saint Léger. He went under several pseudonyms. Was the poet who took this idea of Robinson Crusoe and Friday and urbanized them, put them back in the city after they got back off of the island, and what this kind of urbanization did to them. And Durey takes us through a series of episodes within the first few movements, but then the final movement is actually a distillation of all of these movements one after the other, and you hear he takes you through, it's a lovely effect because he takes you through all the previous movements, and you get a sense of melancholy and longing for what they've lost. Conversely, the Éluard that I'm doing with Jesse has the third movement. The first 2 movements are very, very short, and the third movement is really quite long. And it has this kind of militant aspect to it, I guess. Also, also episodic, but and then not really tonally centered, at least not at the beginning of the piece.
Yeah.
But there's a virility to this movement that is very masculine sounding and very very much like what we're talking about with the idea of drawing somebody in and asking of the listener, can you get behind what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And stand for what you believe in.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think since we're on the sort of topic of the music specifically, I wanted to take the last two questions that I had and sort of combine them in that I think it's fair to assessment of Durey's music that a word that could be described, and I'm sure if we get listings, I'm sure this word will come up, fair or not, is obscure, which I don't know if that's the best term for what this music is, but I think that to certain people that will be. And so I am in defense of obscure music. I feel like Brooklyn Art Song Society puts on a lot of music that presents a lot of music that would be obscure, but I think the question is, how should we make the argument for Durey being less obscure? What should be the argument for his presence in musical life being increased?
Yeah. Well, he's worthwhile. He's beautiful music. I think it's always, that's the number one thing, is the music demonstrates a lot of the trajectory of the 20th century, because it does reflect, he doesn't really, in my opinion, have a uniform sound from the beginning to the end. And so when you travel through his music, you are traveling through the century, and you're walking along with him in those acts of integrity that he pursued. People who are purists like that don't, maybe an overgeneralization, but purists aren't so concerned with being published, maybe.
Yeah.
Getting their name out there. And this is one of the reasons why he is more obscure. I think it's a direct result of his desire to equalize things and to maybe not have his name rise above anybody else's name, but to be in service of those choirs of men and women that he wrote music for, or those composers who were a part of the resistance, or this idea of social equality. It was kind of at odds with the idea of putting his name out there.
Self-promotion. Yeah, I always find that good music is good music, and that there is quite frequently a disconnect in the moment of who are the big name composers who are getting the most recognition in their lifetime, and who ends up, there's sort of classic examples of people like Bach and Mozart not being the most heralded and praised composers of their day, and even Bach famously falling into obscurity and having to get rediscovered. But I do think in a certain way, history is the great equalizer, that in the long stretch of history, it always works out that the composers who are great, who have something to offer, will make it. Right. Even if in their lifetime they're not well promoted, or even if after their lifetime their music's hard. Right. If the music is good, then people will fight to keep it alive. Yeah. And I think that history tends to do a good job of that just by its natural trajectory. But I do think it takes an active effort of people to find the good music, and people and I hope that the result of this concert is someone hearing it and wanting to do more Durey and continuing, because I do think it is great music.
Well, I came back from Paris with the promise of his daughter to send me all of these unpublished manuscripts. And so they're there, and I have them, but I've also, told her that I won't just distribute them willy-nilly. The question is how to get them out there. Purely practically speaking, as a professor, his Lacey Sarah music is great music to introduce to a young undergraduate who's learning French. It's really so tuneful. It's such a gentle kind of introduction to the language. Foray is wonderful, but very complicated poetry. And then, of course, Durey that's complicated poetry as well. But, we're talking like the Petronius Theocritus, all of this music from that general time period, it should be done by young singers.
Yeah, and it's not vocally, I know that the Patron songs that I did could sit comfortably in many different voice types, and two, sat mostly in the middle. It didn't go too high, didn't go too low, would not pose extreme vocal challenges that would make it so that a young singer would be overwhelmed by those technical challenges and not able to focus on making music. I think another element of doing lesser performed music that I like is often, I think there is a certain newness factor of hearing something you've never heard before, especially in classical music. There's a tendency for a small group of very well-known pieces to be done over and over and over again. And no matter how great they are, no matter how great Winterreise is, the 33rd time you hear it performed, it's going to lose a little bit of its luster. And I think that doing lesser-known music, it's sort of like, perhaps, even if it's a slight notch down from an absolute masterpiece, or from the masterpieces that are done often, its newness elevates it, in that you can hear something fresh, you can hear something you've never heard before. It's rare, I think, in life with such easy access to everything, and everything on YouTube and Spotify, to hear something that's great, that you've never heard before, or never even heard of, and can open a whole world of exploration rather than just be, oh yeah, I know that, And I think that has value and interest in and of itself, which is all a good way to plug to come to our concert on December 9th.
Yes.
7:30 p.m., 7 o'clock for the pre-lecture. It's in the Old Stone House, which is in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It's a really great venue. It's probably the perfect venue for art song in many ways. The other singers on it are Jesse Blumberg, baritone, Dominic Armstrong, tenor, and I will be performing the works of Germaine Taillefer that will be interspersed with Durey's work with Laura Strickling, soprano. You can buy tickets on brownpapertickets.com. They're up now. You can also follow us on Facebook, and our Twitter is @BrooklynArtSong. So until next time, thanks for watching, and we hope to see you at the concert. Thanks.